Good morning and welcome to Coffee with Mr. V. Okay, today we are going to do a very quick session on patterns of trade. Okay, it's a relatively small section that comes up in the A-level specification. So we're just going to go through it now. You know the score. If you want to join along with Coffee for Mr. V, go and grab yourself a cup of coffee or whatever your favorite liquid is, put it in a mug, a glass, or a cup, and then come back to me and we will do the synchronized sip. And that's going to be the best part of your day. So here we go. 1, 2, 3. Cheers. I love coffee. So patterns of trade. All right, patterns of trade for me is just a really straightforward idea. Okay, it's just looking at the sorts of trades that different countries do with other countries. And in particular, we need to talk about two things. Okay, those two things are the geographic pattern of trade. Who are we trading with? Yeah, if you're looking at the patterns of trade for a particular country or a particular region, what are the other countries that they're trading with? Who are they? Are they European countries? Are they Asian countries? Are they who are they? Are they next door neighbors or are they miles away? Are they rich countries? Are they poor countries? All these sorts of different things. So who are they trading with? The next one is sometimes described as the commodity pattern of trade, but ultimately it just boils down to what are they trading? And when you talk about what are they trading, we're not talking about necessarily specific individual items, but we are talking about industries. So is it primary product industry or primary sector industries? You know, is it agriculture? Is it mining? Did they grow it from the ground? Did they dig it out of the ground? Primary sector, very, very low value normally. Okay. Then is it secondary? Secondary sector, if you don't know, is sometimes known as manufacturing. It basically means taking those primary products and doing something with them so that you make another one. Classic example would be something like furniture, where you take wood, which is a primary product, but then you kind of cut it down, bang it all together, and you get your table. All right, that's then a secondary product. For the purposes of pattern of trade, I think you should break that down into two different types. What we'd want to call low value secondary sector, which would be things like cheap plastic toys or even cheap wooden furniture. Okay, and then at the higher level, what we might call very high value secondary, we're now talking about engine aircrafts for, aircraft engines, sorry, the sorts of things that Boeing or Rolls-Royce make here. Very, very high value parts for nuclear power stations. What we call very high value. You need a lot of engineering expertise. You need a lot of factory, big factory space with lots of physical capital, but also the skilled labor in order to do it. And then thirdly, we have what we call tertiary sector. Now, tertiary sector, again, can be split into two. You have low value tertiary, things like cleaning, things like hairdressing, low value services, or very high value services, things like legal services, banking services, accountancy, architectural services, that sort of thing. Now, traditionally, we'd pay high value services like legal services or financial services. We certainly export a lot of those. And when you have a question about patterns of trade, the tendency is for us to focus on just the balance of trade. Are we exporting more than we're importing? That's a mistake. To ask you about the balance of trade, then they'll ask you about the balance of trade. But if they're asking you about the patterns of trade, then what they're trying to get at is, do you understand the relationship between the two countries that are trading with each other? Is that going to intensify, or is it going to start breaking away and unraveling? Yeah, are we more or less likely to trade with Europe? Are we more or less likely to trade with Asia? That sort of idea. And what are they trading? Are we more likely to start exporting more high value secondary or importing more primary products? So if you get a question on pattern of trade, and it came up, I think, in 20, would have been the year before, 2019. Okay, there was an essay which ended, gave a scenario. I think it was country X is leaving a trading bloc. How is this going to affect their patterns of trade? Lots of people did a lot of big essay on how it's likely to affect their trade balance. I think exports will go up and imports will come down, stuff like that. Not getting a lot of marks. Okay, the whole point about asking questions in exams about patterns of trade is asking students, getting learners to start thinking about how is that affecting who they're trading with and how are they trading. Now, just as a kind of little rule for us to kind of think about, just as a kind of revision, because ultimately this is what these sessions are meant to be, just a bit of a revision. I've just broken it down into 3 main kind of big ticket ideas for the world in sort of, well, at the start of 2020. Who knows what the end of 2020 is going to look like. But when we talk about trade between MEDCs, remember, are more economically developed countries, or just kind of rich countries, if you want to think about it a different way. Let's say maybe UK and America. All right. What we tend to see is lots of intra-industry trade, intra meaning within industry. So, for example, America exports a lot of cars, but also America imports a lot of cars. America exports a lot of machinery, but it also imports a lot of machinery. And this is characteristic of lots of MEDC to MEDC trade. They're exporting a lot of the same things that they're importing. And that's kind of very counterintuitive, because according to David Ricardo's theory, you kind of specialize in the thing that you're good at and you trade for the thing that you're not very good at. But if we're making cars and then trading back for cars, it doesn't kind of fit that theory. So what's going on? Well, there's 2 real main reasons for that. One I've written down here is that, well, given the fact that it's an MEDC, by definition, then we have rich consumers. Rich consumers, you might argue, tend to be pickier consumers. They have the money that they can afford to buy a foreign luxury if they want. They don't have to be satisfied with the domestic alternative. So when it comes to cars, if I'm an American consumer, I could buy an American car. I could go and buy a Ford, or I have the choice. I'm rich enough that I could buy a Japanese car or an Italian car or a German car. I have all these choices. So I don't have to settle for the American car. And similarly, if we think about maybe the medical industry, if I'm a hospital and I need to buy a machine, I don't know, an X-ray machine or something like that, I don't have to buy the American-built machine. If there's a Japanese machine that has a niche little accessory that does something better than anything that's produced domestically, well, we're rich enough that we can import that in. Okay, so that tends to characterize the trade between MEDCs, and it's not something that you would necessarily have thought of unless you'd seen the data. I mean, it surprised me, I guess, for the first time that I saw it. When we talk about MEDC to LEDC trade, for somebody like, I don't know, in class recently, we've been doing Malawi. Okay, if we're doing America to a Malawi, then what we tend to find is actually it tends to be more of a one-way relationship. So it's really Malawi exporting to the US, and there's not a huge amount of imports going from the US back to Malawi. Malawi, or LEDCs, tend to be exporters of primary products. And when we get into theme 4 in development and economics, we can see perhaps why LEDCs find themselves very primary product dependency. Normally, it's an issue down to the fact that they don't have the human capital or the physical capital, or it could just be that they are naturally endowed with, in Malawi's case, huge uranium reserves. In Zambia's case, huge copper reserves. In Angola's case, huge oil reserves. It could just be that they're naturally blessed with lots of primary products, and that ultimately, therefore, you tend to have comparative advantage there. So LEDCs tend to export very low-value products, such as primary products. I guess in somewhere like Bangladesh or Vietnam's case, it's low-value secondary textiles, going towards the MEDC. Now, if the MEDC is exporting anything, then it's going to be those high-value secondary. But given that we've got a poor country over here, it's not likely to be a huge amount of trade coming back from that MEDC. They're simply not rich enough to be importing American cars or American medical machinery. Okay, so that characterizes that sort of trade. And then finally, we have LEDC to LEDC. And the truth of the matter is that they don't tend to trade much, okay? Despite the fact that you might have next door neighbors and you would have thought, well, actually, that makes sense that they would tend to trade. They don't. And maybe one of the reasons is for that actually LEDCs next door to each other will tend to produce the same thing, because if it's agricultural, then they'll have the same climate as each other for that particular product. If it's mining and one country has a uranium reserve, then it's quite likely that the next door neighbor is likely to have the uranium reserve as well. And it's also the fact that, they're LEDCs, they're poor, and therefore they can't afford to import lots of products from other countries. They have to settle for the domestically made thing. So there are my kind of 3 big ticket headlines when it comes to patterns of trade in this particular time in which we're living. So just to finish off then, if you have questions about patterns of trade, talk about the geographical pattern of trade, talk about the commodity pattern of trade, and also try and give an understanding of why. Why is it set up like this? So why, for example, does the UK trade a lot with the EU? Well, that's kind of regional. They're close. There's proximity. Therefore, transportation costs are lower. Therefore, the imports are likely to be cheaper. It's also down to the fact that they're in a free trade agreement with those countries, or at least they still are up until now. And therefore, there are no import tariffs. There's no import tariffs on UK exports when they reach overseas, and therefore we're more likely to sell UK exports. Why do we sell a lot to America, Japan, China? Well, those three countries are the three biggest economies in the world. So it shouldn't really be a surprise that we export to those because they're rich. You have a lot of money. There's a lot of money in those economies. So no doubt they'll be buying lots of UK goods. America, China, and Japan are probably feature on everybody's largest export markets because they're the richest countries in the world. Okay, they have the most consumed. They have them in terms of GDP. There is the most money in those countries. So where are you going to sell to? You're going to sell to the places with most money. That's kind of how the world works, isn't it? Resources are allocated to where there is wealth. So if those are the richest countries in the world, you would expect exports to flow over there. The UK also trades with a lot of kind of very strange countries that wouldn't appear on other people's lists, but it's down to political ties and Commonwealth ties. So ex-Commonwealth countries, former colony countries. Australia and New Zealand are really good examples. We trade a lot with those. They wouldn't appear on anybody's list, but it's because of our cultural ties that we trade a lot with those countries. And then finally, in the spec, it asks you to consider factors that might affect the patterns of trade. And if you go on the spec, it will give you, I think, the 4 or 5 key ones that it's really interested in. You could come up with ones of your own. What will happen when the UK comes out of the EU? Well, the textbook would say that once we come out of the EU, we no longer have that free trade arrangement. And therefore, you would expect the pattern of trade, for the UK to change quite considerably. We probably won't be trading with EU countries quite so much because there'll be now tariffs. But we might change our pattern of trade so that we're trading more with America, with China, with India. I mean, if you remember the Brexit debates, this was Nigel Farage's biggest ideas about trade, which was actually the world is changing. You have these huge emerging economies like China, like India. Sometimes you call them the mint countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and sometimes we even talk the mint countries now. Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey have these hugely growing emerging economies getting richer all the time. Why are we concentrating in the old money world of Europe, and why are we not concentrating with trade of those places? So we might see the patterns of trade change quite dramatically as we leave the EU. On the other hand, you should always be looking to give the evaluation. Will it happen quite like that? Well, not necessarily, because a lot of our companies are probably TNCs and they've already set up supply chains within Europe. Geographically, we can't change the fact that our closest our closest countries are places like Spain, Holland, France, Germany. I mean, regardless of whether the fact we're in the EU or not, these are still going to be the closest countries to us. So in terms of transportation costs, that's always going to be low. Another factor that they give in the specification is exchange rates. And the exchange rates, again, is fairly straightforward one. If your exchange rate depreciates against a particular trading partner, you would expect to sell more exports to them and less import and receive less imports from them. But of course, that will depend on price elasticity of demand. So again, go to your commodities pattern of trade. Are you importing lots of necessities? Are you exporting lots of necessities? Or on the other hand, are you exporting luxuries? If you're exporting luxuries and the exchange rate falls, then your quid's in. Yeah, price elastic, price goes down, you're going to sell a hell of a lot more. Your export revenue is going to go up. On the other hand, if you're exporting necessities, you're not going to see a huge amount of change. So that's not necessarily a good thing. So there's all these things you've got to think about with the patterns of trade. It is a relatively small topic and it's not particularly hard. It's mainly common sense. But with this, and with a bit of an understanding of how perhaps the UK's pattern of trade works, I'm sure you'll be absolutely fine. Right, that's it from me. Thank you for joining. And I'll see you next time. Bye.